Welcome back to the news today. For Bashar al-Assad's regime in Syria, the nuclear deal with Iran is nothing but good news. Assad was quick to congratulate his close regional ally in Tehran, who with billions of assets released from sanctions is sure to boost its aid to the regime. 15 years into Assad's rule, correspondent Ayman Sikseck looks at the man once viewed as a reformer.
On July 17, 2000, the fate of Syria changed forever. al-Assad, the country's ruler for over 30 years, began preparing the ground for the country's future. His successor, his youngest son Bashar, was initially seen as a reformer.
Principal thing we know it, that Dr. Bashar al-Assad will be one of the member of the political bureau and he will be the leader of the party.
But 15 years later, Syria would deteriorate into civil war, suffer the violence of a ruthless terrorist organization and an unforgiving government, and finally raided with bombs by US forces. So what happened? Damascus. Born in 1965, Bashar al-Assad had no prospects of one day ruling Syria. Having studied ophthalmology in London, he was his father's third and last choice as successor, after his brother and uncle. One was deemed too corrupt, the other died before assuming power. So the unlikely president had a lot to prove. And the first target was Lebanon. In 1998, prior to assuming power as president, Assad took over the Lebanon file to establish his own power base in the neighboring country, in defiance of Lebanese Prime Minister Rafiq al-Hariri. It would be 5 more years before Hariri and 21 others would be killed in a car explosion in Beirut, further deteriorating relations between the countries. Assad, now perceived as an expansionist president, was widely blamed for the killing. Though he never assumed responsibility, his policy led to extreme changes in the neighboring Arab country. Lebanon would never be as stable again. In Syria that same year, Assad's troops were brought back from Lebanon to a hero's welcome. Starting in the mid-2000s, international powers became wise to the nature of Assad's rule. In 2007, then Speaker of the House Nancy Pelosi defied President George Bush to become the highest-ranking U.S. official to meet with Assad in Syria, since relations between the two countries came to a halt 4 years before. For today's ruling president in the United States, it's clear that the key to solving the conflict in Syria is widespread regional cooperation.
We're not going to solve the problems of Syria unless there's buy-in from the Russians, the Iranians, the Turks, our Gulf partners. It's too chaotic, there are too many factions, there's too much money and too many arms.
But with support from major powers such as Russia, Bashar al-Assad's rule seemed unfazed. But things took a turn for the worse for the Syrian president when his own people rose up against him, highlighting al-Assad's biggest fear, an Arab Spring in Syria. January 2011, Syrians take to the streets in the country's biggest demonstrations in decades. Their goal, political reforms, an extremely worrying prospect for the Assad regime. And the reaction soon followed. In what's considered to be the bloodiest crackdown on Arab Spring protests, an estimated 5,000 civilians had been killed within a year of the launch of the protests. Assad claimed the protests were organized by Western powers looking to topple him, but public opposition grew stronger. But the year 2015 brought what seems to be good news for Assad, the Iran nuclear deal, which the Syrian leader praised as historic. The reason? Now that Iran has secured the lifting of sanctions, Assad is looking forward to the country further financing his crumbling regime, now locked in a war against its own people.
And to understand a little bit more about the war, with me right now is correspondent Ayman Sikseck.
Good evening, Lucy.
So, Ayman, when we are talking about the fact that Bashar al-Assad, let's say, is not the best ruler in the world, when we are talking about civil war, when we are talking about thousands and thousands of people, hundreds of thousands of people are getting killed under his hands, what is the next step? Because this specific deal, the Iranian deal, it's not going to put him out.
No, it's not going to put him out, and in his view, and he's likely to be right, it will help him out, continue out his rule in Syria. Now, what's happening is that Iran is, of course, financing certain powers in Syria, and though Iran promised, between parentheses, not to support terrorist organizations, the U.S. has to rely on its promise. That's the only thing the U.S. has to go on. And Assad knows that it's Iran's interest to continue supporting his regime in Syria. It's a regime that does good to Iran, one hand washes the other. And he knows that from now on, he will be able to continue his rule there.
You know, Ayman, it's amazing, because if I'm thinking maybe the worst things that can happen to the world are the best things that can happen to Bashar al-Assad, if it's ISIS. And if we're talking about ISIS, the Islamic State, and if we're talking about Iran being nuclear or Iran signing this deal. So this is amazing to see that this is the biggest cliche. Something good always turns out good. Something bad turns out good for somebody else.
Well, you know, working on this story today and reading these numbers of people being killed in Syria every year by terrorist organizations, by Assad's troops, by U.S. air raids, it's surprising that anyone is alive in Syria except for Assad. It's nearly that bad at this point.
When everybody predicted that maybe we're about to witness the fall of Bashar al-Assad, he is staying still. And it was amazing that just 2 months ago, we were talking about the fact that he might lose the grip on the country, and now he's even stronger than ever. And more than that, sometimes we are even hearing some Israeli officials here in Israel saying, better the devil you know. Better because Bashar al-Assad is maintaining the control in the northern border, and we need the control in the northern border for now.
Well, that's exactly right. There's two reasons why Assad stays in power. The first is the one that you mentioned, and that also goes for the Syrian people. They also feel, some of them, that it's better the devil they know. Now that the IS is taking certain powers in Syria, they feel that, well, if Assad is toppled, we'll be under IS rule, which is much, much worse. The second is the failure of the Syrian opposition. The only thing the Syrian opposition is offering to the people is the toppling of Assad. It's not offering new ideology, not peace prospects, not religious coexistence, only let's topple Assad, and the Syrian people are not buying it.
And always we're talking about the Syrian opposition, and it seems that we will never know who is exactly the Syrian opposition and who can stand in front of Bashar al-Assad. Thank you very, very much, Ayman Sikseck, for this beautiful report. Thank you.